Good evening, everyone. I am Denis Wara, Gallery 400 Public Programs Manager, and I want to thank you all for joining us this evening for a discussion between artist Samuel Levi Jones and critic Camille Bacon. This program is part of our exhibition, Young, Gifted, and Black, the Lumpkin Bukutsi Family Collection of Contemporary Art, which is on view at Gallery 400 until December 11th. Our last program, well, this is our second last program, but our last program is titled To Be Young, Gifted, and Black, which will be a conversation between Chicago-based writer Essence McDowell and archivist Skyla S. Hearn. The two will be in a conversation about Lorraine Hansberry's legacy in their research, documentation, and preservations of Chicago's Black communities. This will be a very exciting conversation, and please register for this profound conversation on December 9th using the link in the chat. And I'm very excited for today's conversation between a very great friend of mine, Camille, and the artist Samuel Levi Jones. And before we start, I'd like to call into relation to the land many of us are on today, the broadest city of Chicago, named after the Algonquin name for the river whose shores were lined with wild leeks, was and continues to be an indigenous place. Owing to the multiple waterways that converge here, Chicago is the ancestral home of the Three Fires Confederacy, consisting of the Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, in addition to Miami, Illinois, Inuka, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee nations. Today, Chicago has the third largest urban Native population in the United States, with more than 65,000 Native Americans in the greater metropolitan area. The American Indian Center in Albany Park, founded in 1953 in the era of relocation, remains to be the oldest urban Indian center in the country. I hope to not merely acknowledge the land we are upon as a performative gesture, but also invite us to call into relation these lands, histories, and nations. They've not ceased to exist. We also acknowledge the significant work that Gallery 400 and UIC and the state of Illinois has yet to do in honoring these relations and rectifying this colonial presence with other struggles. These Americas are built on violence and erasure, and we bring these histories with us. Those native to this land, indigenous people from other territories, as well as white settlers by conquest, and those of us who've come here by force or otherwise, as a result of slavery, colonialism, imperialism, and ongoing wars. When we enter any room, even or especially virtual rooms, we must bring these histories into view. With this knowledge, we enter, we meet here in hopes of making a different world. I encourage you all to check out Chicago's list of indigenous-led land back and reparations projects, which you can find in the chat. Today, we are joined by Camille Bacon and Samuel Levi Jones, and the two of them will converse on the material life of Samuel Levi Jones's practice, which constitutes the deconstruction of medical text and athletic materials like football skins and tackling pads to create abstract works. Jones challenges the ethics and authority of medical and sports industries by stripping those chosen materials of their capacity to sustain harm. The two will broadly discuss photography, pop culture, and political strategies Jones employs in his aesthetic practice and everyday life. I now introduce the lovely Camille Bacon, a Chicago-based writer and critic who is crafting a sweet Black writing life as inspired by the words of poet Nikki Finney. Please welcome Sam and Camille with a warm round of applause.
Thank you for the introduction, Denny. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Sam. Samuel Levi Jones was born in Marion, Indiana. He received a BA from Taylor University, a BFA from the Herron School of Art and Design, and an MFA from Mills College, and he is currently based between Indianapolis and Chicago. As Denny mentioned, Jones investigates issues of manipulation and the rejection of control in the broadest sense. More specifically, he explores the framing of power structures by desecrating historical materials and reassembling them into minimalist, abstract compositions. These historical materials include, but are not limited to, encyclopedias, legal texts, history books, medical texts, football skins, and tackling pads, all of which have been positioned as neutral entities, despite their function as mechanisms of oppression. By reimagining these materials, which have been used to surveil and regulate Black life, Jones invites a much needed sense of skepticism around unchecked technologies of white supremacy. Jones's manipulation of historical materials began when he was given a set of encyclopedias by a fellow grad student in 2011, which he later transformed into a work called 48 Portraits Underexposed, which we will discuss a little bit later, time permitting. Since 2011, Jones has continued this practice of unmaking historical documents, as in the case of a work called Alkaline 2018, which we will see in a moment when we have our slides. And that work was made of deconstructed medical texts. Scholar Lee Rayford has described Jones's practice as such. Jones disassembles the encyclopedias, law books, and other reference materials by removing the covers with an X-Acto knife and separating out the pages within. Also removed are the thin layers of cardboard that give the covers their firm, unyielding body. The covers are soaked in water to soften them. The books are torn apart, leaving the heavy cloth covers and their versos worn, scarred, and exposed. Jones then assembles these covers, which he refers to as skins, into grids, arranging them first onto canvas before stitching them together into mostly monochromatic works via sewing machine. Jones has also taken this deconstruction of the medical text a step further by pulping them, which we will also discuss in a little bit. And I'd like to begin by sharing a quote from the Undercommons by Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, which can serve to sort of frame Jones's practice and also as a bit of a jumping off point for our conversation tonight. Denny, do you mind sharing the second slide on the slideshow? Thank you. All right. So Jack Halberstam writes, "We cannot be satisfied with the recognition and acknowledgement generated by the very system that denies A, that anything was ever broken, and B, that we deserve to be the broken part. So we refuse to ask for recognition, and instead we want to take apart, dismantle, tear down the structure that right now limits our ability to find one another, to see beyond it, and to access the places that we know lie outside its walls." Next slide, please, Denny. Thank you. By unmaking the bastions of knowledge that have safeguarded oppressive logics for so long, Jones's practice is quite literally invested in the taking apart, dismantling, and tearing down that Halberstam references. This is the work I mentioned earlier, Alkaline, made of deconstructed medical books on canvas. Our time tonight, as Denny mentioned, will orbit around Sam's deconstruction of medical texts and football practice materials in particular. And with all that said, we can begin. So Sam, my check-in question for you today is, I'm curious about what has moved you, if anything, today. I know you were watching birds earlier. I'm curious to hear. Denny, do you know if Sam is in the room anymore, actually? Because I know he's having Wi-Fi problems.
Yeah, he keeps jumping in and out of the room.
Let me see. Do you see him?
No, he must have gotten kicked out.
Well, we will hope that he comes back. And until then, just give me a second.
Okay.
Okay. I guess we can start by chatting about the work, Denny.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, cool. I also have a detailed shot of this. If you want to go to slide number 5, then we can zoom in a little bit more. Okay, so this is a kind of close-up image of the work Alkaline. And the reason I zoomed in is because I really want us to get a sense of how illegible these panels are. Like, upon gazing at it at first glance, I cannot necessarily discern that these covers were at one point kind of safeguarding the material that laid within them. And then also, okay, I think he's back. And then also thinking about kind of the exposed threads. And the first thing it made me think of, I don't know if you've ever had this experience with like a garment of clothing, but if there's one loose thread and you pull it hard enough, everything kind of falls apart. He keeps coming in and out, so strange. But yeah, so these compositions to me at once are incredibly precarious, as in like, if you pull this one thread, it will all kind of come apart. But at the same time, they feel rigid as well, and kind of foreboding. And I wonder if you have ever noticed something similar, or what comes up for you when you look at this zoomed in kind of image of the work.
For me, I find it interesting to talk about Sam's work as paintings, in the way that we think about the history of painting as the application of paint on a canvas. But then here, there's a whole different kind of application. But then even the way that the frame of these materials frames a canvas reminds me again that we're not looking at a painting. But what else could you define these works as? Like, would you call it an embroidery work? Would you call it a painting? Because we can look at it and say that, of course, there is a history of color field. Like, we can see that very apparently here. Like, there's some kind of reference to color field and minimalism as well too. But then it also makes me think of how, I mean, to your point of how if I were to just pull this string off of these stitched materials, it would totally come apart. Which makes me think about the process of Sam's practice and the way that he deconstructs and reconstructs these materials to make new meanings out of them. But Sam is in the room right now, so I'll give him I'll pass the baton to him.
Fabulous.
Sorry about that.
Welcome back, Sam.
Can you see me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I have some connection problems.
So we started talking a little bit about the work, but I want to run it all the way back and ask the check-in question again about what has moved you today.
Oh my gosh. I've been down and out for a little bit of time, so I'm just like mending and healing and relaxing, hanging out with the family. I was supposed to be traveling and cut that out of the plans to make sure that everyone's doing well. So I've just been hanging out at home, trying to get some work done. And as I shared with you earlier, staring at some birds on the bird feeders today.
That woodpecker was so cool looking. Thank you for that. Denny, can we advance to the next slide, please? Okay, so as I mentioned, the kind of basis of deconstructing medical text is going to be a major point of conversation today. So while Sam and I were kind of preparing for this conversation, we spoke a little bit about the experience Serena Williams had when she gave birth to her daughter, Olympia. So Serena Williams, the infamous tennis player, has a history of pulmonary embolism, so blood clots in her lungs. And when she was in labor, she kind of was warning her doctors that the specific kind of pain she was experiencing felt very similar to the pain she experienced in 2011 when she was hospitalized for this pulmonary embolism. And the doctors kind of ignored her warnings. And I read that as a moment of not taking Black women's embodied knowledge seriously, which has a very, very long history, dating all the way back to the person who is kind of lauded as the quote father of gynecology, J. Marion Sims, who operated on enslaved Black women without anesthesia, essentially tortured them in order to found this new kind of clinical medical practice. He also is named for inventing the speculum. And so my first question for you is kind of about the origin of your work with medical books. I wonder what the impetus was. I wonder what was happening surrounding you in the world at large that kind of drove you to begin deconstructing these materials. Oh, wait, you're muted, Sam.
Okay, I got it. There are a few different things that had led me to the use of medical books. I think one of them was, my wife's involvement in the medical industry. She worked as a med-surg nurse for 12 years, and having lots of conversations about this idea of pushing pharmaceuticals to sort of treat symptoms or sort of put a band-aid on symptoms rather than helping them. And I think, also in the time that we've been together and the decisions that we've made around, our own personal health and, first of all, through diet. One of the things that we did some years ago, probably about 6, 7, 8 years ago, we did a cleanse. It's called a Whole 30 diet, which is an elimination diet, which consists of cutting out sugar, artificial sweeteners, no alcohol, no grains, no legumes, no dairy. And it was sort of like a reset, if you will. And, a reset, through just taste buds, and some of the experiences that we went through that were just sort of like toxins that were being expelled from the body. And, I remember 2 to 3 weeks, maybe 3 weeks into the process of it, sort of having these natural euphoric highs because of the elimination of these toxins within the body. And, we've just sort of, there's lots of, personal experience through that, and also in things that you've talked about, so J.B. and Sims, and even reading the book. I haven't read all of the book yet. It's called Medical Apartheid, which is a very difficult book to read. I had put it down a number of different times because it's so gut-wrenching to read of the atrocities imposed in particular on the Black body. But when the first group of medical books that I started working with, they actually were given to me or picked up by a collector of mine who was living in San Francisco at the time. And I must have gotten 1,000 books in that moment, and they were put out on the street to be picked up by the city dump. And that was, had interest in getting the books. They're sort of a bit difficult to acquire. And it was this magical moment in getting that amount of books at one time. But to piggyback on, how Serena was dismissed by a medical physician, I had a similar experience when I was playing college football. I had this issue which is called epididymitis, and it's sort of a infection in the testicular area, and it comes through. And I've had issues with it recently because I started doing some physical training about a year and a half ago, and I didn't realize one of the issues that sort of contributed to it was, doing heavy weightlifting without emptying the bladder, because what happens is the urine, backs up through the system and it causes infection. But I had this experience when I went to the doctor because I had severe pain, and he literally yelled at me, wrote me an antibiotic script, and threw it at me and said, "Put a condom on it," and dismissed me from his office. So, I just sort of, I didn't take it as a racial thing at the time, but, I wouldn't, pass it at, I wouldn't, dismiss it as, something that actually had happened in that moment. So, yeah.
Man, oh man. He yelled at you and kicked you out of his office?
Yeah, he wrote me a script and basically ended the whatever was going on there, and didn't take any information from me whatsoever other than that, and denied what was going on with me. Yeah, it was a horrible experience.
Mm. It reminds me of what you said earlier about this question of treating the symptom versus treating the symptom versus treating the underlying cause that's causing the symptom. And something Denny and I spoke a little bit about in your absence was what it means to kind of leave the edges of these books exposed and to leave the kind of like connecting threads that you place in them exposed. And yeah, I just want to offer that as well as we look at this work cleansing. I'm also interested to ask you a little bit about Henrietta Lacks and think a little bit about how this Black woman, Henrietta Lacks, was diagnosed with cervical cancer. And while she was being examined by her doctor, he removed a portion of her tumor and sent it down the hall to the lab. And this was happening at a time when scientists were completely perplexed by how to create and grow cells in culture independent of a kind of natural biological organism. And for some reason that scientists still do not fully understand today, Henrietta Lacks's cells survived in culture. And we know them today as HeLa cells. And I, for a number of years, studied biology and was in multiple classes where professors would kind of show us these scans of HeLa cells and not talk about the historical context and not talk about kind of the real human being that was on the other side of this process. And I received severe pushback from both professors when I asked them to kind of speak to the entire class about where these cells came from. And most recently, and very, very relevantly today, HeLa cells were instrumental in forming the kind of molecular compound that we now see in COVID vaccines. So again, thinking about how these histories are so fundamental to our health and well-being today, but these texts that you're unmaking have kind of contorted our conception of what it means to be well, what it means to be healthy, what it means to be, a healthy body out in the world. So I just wanted to offer that as well. And I wonder if you think about Henrietta Lacks when you're making work, or if that particular history has ever come up for you.
It has come up quite a bit. Gosh, there was, one particular, I mean, this is sort of a maybe slightly off topic. I had an opportunity to participate in an exhibition around Henrietta Lacks that I chose not to participate in. And I was using medical books at the time, but it was sort of like, I think it very disheartening too, because, I wanted to participate in the way that felt safe for me in my practice. And my expectations weren't being met. And I think about that in relationship to so the commodification of the body and being dismissed in terms of just having a right to have a say and having being respected. That's my relationship to it, but it's very problematic to have the body be used and abused in such a way and not be given the respect that's due to it.
I wonder also if there ever will be an exhibition format or an exhibition protocol that is safe for that kind of work, and that's something we can explore offline more, but I appreciate you bringing that in. I also, something that you said earlier about 48 portraits underexposed. So thinking about the multiple uses of this term underexposed, as in literally you cannot necessarily see these portraits unless you approach them from a particular angle, but also metaphorically and literally underexposed, as in these figures have not been given their due in history. And I want to sit with that for a second and think about the moments where we can clamor for visibility, but also the moments where visibility is dangerous for us. So thinking about how I was reading an essay by Andrea Hickey that she wrote on the occasion of an exhibition at Pace that really thought through this transition from minimalist aesthetics as being interested in kind of like the purity of form into kind of more contemporary forms of minimalism, which really allow us to get at the root of the structures that are deleterious for all of us, which I think your work is absolutely doing. But in the essay, she thinks about how during the 20th century, most of our infrastructure was visible. So we think about roads, we think about railways, but as we've transitioned into the so-called information age, a lot of our infrastructure is invisible. If we think about like fiber optic cables, for example, like I understand that the internet is a thing, that's how we're able to commune in this way, but I don't necessarily know what fiber optic cables look like, nor do I really understand how they work. So she's thinking about infrastructure as these kind of like laws and regulations that mandate how we can move, how we can make meaning in our own lives. But what happens when those structures are rendered invisible or rendered abstract? I think it makes it a lot harder if you cannot necessarily see clearly what you're up against. And on the contrary, in all the ways that power kind of guarantees its own recapitulation by remaining invisible, there are so many efforts made to make sure that the Black body is always visible and always accessible. If we think about kind of the circulation of videos of police brutality on Instagram, for example, like I remember summer of 2020, like you could not go online without encountering something that felt so proximal to my own death and the death of people that I loved. So with all of that in mind, I'm curious about the decision, kind of like as we're thinking about people like Henrietta Lacks, as we're thinking about even your own experiences with the medical industrial complex, you're not figuring necessarily the people who have been harmed. Instead, you're exposing the kind of like technologies and infrastructures that have allowed that harm to happen. And tying all the way back to this question of the undercommons, there's this quote, and I don't remember it exactly, but Fred Moten says something along the lines of, I don't want a world, or excuse me, I'm not working to end colonialism, I'm working to end the world that made colonialism make sense in the first place. And that to me feels very, very in line with this question of unmaking. And I know this isn't even necessarily really a question, just kind of a reflection, but I'm wondering if you can speak on that.
I mean, I think about, gosh, you know, the sort of the system that you talk about, or that you mentioned, what in the way that which Fred addressed it, in terms of the system that exists and how you know, the Black and brown body has sort of been able to participate in the system that exists, that's been created in a way that's been denied to keep the Black and brown body out. And we're so quick and ready to participate and align ourselves with it, rather than going in and disrupting it and changing it. It's very problematic. I mean, that's sort of, you know, what I can say to that, you know, just, you know, in a very brief way. And I just sort of, you know, even in thinking about participating in the art world and going in spaces that typically have kept us out. And gosh, you know, we have such, you know, potential power to change and shift things, create new spaces. And you know, one of the things that I've sort of been thinking a whole lot about too is, you know, the frustrations that come about and sort of still waiting for things to sort of like these already existing structures to accommodate, if you will. There's not enough time.
And I think it also loops back to something we spoke about in our first conversation. Like, I remember you said something about how important it is for us to spread out. So thinking about your decision, of course, being informed by a bunch of things, but one of them being the decision to be in Indianapolis as opposed to a place like Chicago, as opposed to a place like New York or LA, for example. Again, obviously informed by a number of things, but I recall you saying it's like this desire to spread out and cover more ground. And
I feel like I need more space.
yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. And also, it sometimes feels like a sacrifice. It sometimes, at least for me, yeah, like to be in places that are absolutely not trained to accommodate you, let alone be a space where you can genuinely feel safe. And I'm talking down to like the nervous system level of like, what does it take to quell yourself? And I think that's a lot harder to do if you're surrounded by structures and people who you know for a fact are not interested in keeping you alive.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it's twofold. I think, you know, it feels like in a lot of ways that, you know, I'm on an island. You know, there are places that I'm somewhat close to Chicago, and you know, I make my way there, or California or New York. But still, like, you know, a lot of people that I'm closely connected to and tied to, I rarely get to see on a regular basis. And I've been back here for almost 5 years, and I don't see very many people on a regular basis, and for various reasons, but it's different. It's not the same. And all at the same time, you know, I recently joined the museum board here and trying to, you know, offer something in that way. And it's a challenge. It's still a challenge. But you know, I don't know. I try to do what I can, and not to have too much pity on myself, and keep moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I wonder, I don't know, I feel like this is a good moment to also just acknowledge the kind of psychic spiritual weight of engaging these materials. And I'm curious about if you ever read the books that you're deconstructing or like flip through them at any point.
Yeah, some of the titles of the books you'll really hit hard. I don't typically open books and read them. You know, there was a book that was titled, I actually have it on a work. I can't remember exactly what it is, but I do a lot of redacting in titles and make phrases in different words. But you know, there was a psychology book, and it had something to do with like the psychology of Black children.
I got it. Hold up.
Do you?
Yeah. Boom. Can you see it? I can't see myself.
Read it to me.
Okay.
Read it to me.
It's the psychological development of minority group children.
Yeah, I mean, I probably should have spent some time with that, but I'm thinking a whole lot about this idea of as if minority children are so much different than any other children, in a way that, like, you know, going back to what you're saying about J. Marion Sims and like his study on the female Black body, and sort of assuming that there's no pain that's felt by the body. It's horrendous.
Absolutely horrendous. Absolutely. And also, like, speculums are still used. I've had to endure that, and it's not comfortable. And I just wonder, as I wonder very often, if it hadn't been J. Marion Sims to inaugurate the school of thought that we know as gynecology, like, would my doctor visits feel less harrowing and like sometimes borderline traumatic? We will never know, but it is something that I also think about a lot.
Yeah, there's one thing that came to mind, you know, talking about gynecology, or even Serena and you know, childbirth and C-sections. And you know, my wife and I talk a lot about how physicians will schedule C-sections for their own personal accommodation, not for the accommodation of the patient. And the issue that happens is that, you know, when the baby passes through the birth canal, you know, there's this natural thing that happens where the baby has a stronger immune system because of the passing of that. And I guess now they do this thing where they, you know, will wipe the fluids, if you will, on the baby's face or whatnot, but it's still not the damn same. And I think too, in going back to also talking about this idea of abstraction, we're so damn abstracted that we take little time to pay attention to what's going on and sort of see the problems. And then we have these individuals who are professionals, and because you're not the professional, your opinion and your say doesn't matter. And it's time to push back on that.
I feel like that's also a deeply, deeply Black feminist thing to say, thinking about emotional kind of auto theory as a very, very valid form of knowledge production. And we can touch more on that later. But yeah, what does it mean that all the ways that my body is very aware of the information I'm taking in around me, whether or not I'm safe, all of these things, and for that information to be discounted because we are not, quote, experts, absolutely ridiculous, especially in the medical context. So thank you once again for bringing that up. And it's also like all the ways that we are kind of trained against being able to very precisely, clearly articulate and name the ways that we are abstracted. Feels like a big piece of something that we have to overcome. Because it's like, you can't pin it down until you know what it is, obviously. And if we're not trained or training ourselves to name these things, then that's when the kind of feedback loop is just allowed to continue, and our capacity to interrupt it is completely severed. I'm also curious about another thing you've told me, is that one of the great joys of making these works is being able to be privy to the conversations that they kind of open out onto. And I'm really fascinated by the conceptual value of softening these book covers. Like, I understand the utilitarian purpose, like you need to remove them from the cardboard, obviously, and like water is a brilliant way of doing that. But also, conceptually speaking, if we think about what it means that you're soaking these things in water, again, to soften them, to render them more tactile, to render them less rigid, I wonder if that energy is kind of carried across the canvas and kind of also allows the person who's on the other end of it to also soften and enter into a conversation that often feels so spiky and precarious and sometimes terrifying for people.
Yeah, I thought of the word malleable in this idea of sort of, I think, in a lot of ways we come at things sort of, I don't know, we're taught to be sort of like hard and rigid. And how do we become more malleable? How do we sort of look at things in a non-binary way? We have this sort of, especially this day and age with like, polarization and the extreme polarization and politicization of things and the way that we think about things. And have this like very rigid way of like not wanting to give that up and look at the world in a different way. But yeah, through these works, there's and through and I rarely use text within works, and sometimes I do, and but for the most part I don't. And I think visually speaking, it's amazing to be able to have these objects to have the viewer experience them in a way that just sort of like creates curiosity and ask what's going on and creates this dialogue and this engagement. And that's for me the most pleasant thing in doing the work.
Thank you for that. I'm wondering, okay, Denny with the slides. Perfect, because I was about to say, do you want to transition to talking about football materials?
Why not?
All right. So this is a work called A Neck for a Neck. And I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about it. Today was my first time encountering this.
Yeah, this isn't a work that I heck, I don't think I've ever shared this work publicly. This is the work I actually made in graduate school studying photography, and it was my last project of the program. And you know what, in talking about, so in the exhibition, there is, you know, a work that's made from football materials specifically. So these vinyl materials that are used in football tackling pads or dummies, if you will. And that was the first time I had revisited that work since doing this work that was very personal, because of the whole Colin Kaepernick ordeal. But for me in this work, yeah, so that's the work that I was referencing. But in the previous slide there, that one, neck for neck, you know, I played university football at a school called Taylor University here in Indiana, and experienced discrimination on the field by not giving sort of equal opportunity to play. And it was just sort of really strange to me because I thought I was in a place and in an environment to where, you know, at that point in time that, you know, I didn't think that it was actually happening. And it goes back to what you were saying about the language that's used, the language that's used against us to sort of, you know, invalidate what we're feeling and what we're going through. And so, you know, I mean, you know, I don't know the biblical references, but so, you know, the references of, you know, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth sort of a thing. But, you know, through my experience, I sort of felt dehumanized in a way, in such that, you know, not being given the opportunity, and sort of, you know, these were kind of mementos that was given from the team. The football there was a ball that was signed by the team, and it basically just sort of transitions in from, you know, I'm hellish there, sort of like, it's sort of like the identity of myself is removed. And then with the half football on and sort of the blackface, it's this idea of, you know, the black skin wasn't allowed to exist within the uniform in the way that everyone else did. And from the transition of the football into the jersey, which becomes a noose, so this idea of, yeah, you know, imposing the treatment that I was sort of it was just sort of like taking it with him in my own hands. And I don't know, yeah, putting the Klansman in a noose, if you will. But yeah, that was a very tough experience for me. And I shared with you that I would always have these reoccurring dreams of sort of like reliving these scenarios of like what I would do differently to, like, as if it was something I was doing wrong, to not get the opportunity that everyone else was getting. And it took my art practice, it took the practice of making, it took physically leaving Indiana when I moved to graduate school, or moved to California for graduate school, to for these dreams to stop happening, to stop reoccurring.
Was there a point, because I remember you saying something along the lines of like these reoccurring dreams, you would pass through the entire experience and attempt to find a loophole where you don't end up traumatized at the end of it. And I wonder if, like, obviously time space is malleable too, in the same way we're talking about malleability of language, of these books, of the information that they house. Did they stop because you were able to kind of rewrite that timeline for yourself? Did they stop because you have this like physical distance from Indiana? Like, what do you think caused that transition?
It was definitely the physical distance. Oh my God. I mean, this is, I tell you how deep it was. Because I still had a year of eligibility left, and I decided to not come back. And and part of my attempt to rewrite that, I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but I'll say it anyway. I applied to, in applying to graduate programs, I actually applied to the graduate program at the University of Notre Dame, thinking that I was actually going to walk onto the football team to sort of rewrite, sort of like, or change my experience, if you will. It was pretty fucking intense.
Oh my God, Sam. Thank you for sharing that. Because the other thing is, we can all go on Netflix and watch the Colin Kaepernick series and think about the ways, and like think about the ways that that experience is recapitulated for other people as well. And so then once you realize that after all, you're not as isolated as you think you might be, it becomes a lot easier to understand that you were never the problem, and understand that the histories from which your pain derives are like not ones that you've brought on yourself, which I think sometimes makes it a little bit easier to shoulder.
It is. That I haven't finished that series yet, but it's really, really hard to watch, and there are some scenes in there that really hit hard. But yeah.
I'm curious about, like, obviously the football works and the fact that they haven't often been kind of like discussed or written about necessarily. If we think about the work invoking medical texts or legal texts, I wonder if those feel easier potentially to talk about because they are not as personalized. And I also wonder if we think about kind of the extension of white supremacy through the legal text and through the medical text. One thing that I don't think is often talked about is how the game of football is also deeply entrenched with this question of displaying the Black body in pain, displaying the Black body enduring these really, really hard hits on a literal level. And I know Hank Willis Thomas's Cotton Bowl literally visualizes this. So these two people, you have a line bisecting the middle of the composition. On one hand, there's someone crouched down picking cotton, and directly facing them, there is someone like ready to do a football play. I don't know the technical language. Please feel free to correct me at any point. But I'm curious about how deconstructing these like football tackling pads, which I must also mention are the same ones that you practiced with in high school, which I feel like is a super important detail. But how does it help you deconstruct, on the one hand, this deeply personal experience, but also draw it back out to a structural level of thinking about football as this extension or this like terrain onto which white supremacy is recapitulated?
I think part of the process and change, the how do I say, the evolution in working with the material and working with the subject matter is that I've sort of, I don't know if reinvented myself or I don't let it define me. Because, you know, at that point in time, it was sort of, you know, I mean, I one time calculated the amount of hours that went into playing on a football team during the season. It was something like 35 hours a week.
Oh my God. That's literally a full-time job.
Yeah. And there's no time, very little time for anything else. And, you know, when I took a photography class my last semester, it was the beginning of sort of like reprogramming myself. You know, making art was reprogramming myself, and it was sort of like a rediscovery. And it was, you know, very liberating, because I sort of took on an entirely different life, and it no longer, all those sort of experiences no longer defined who I was, and I was able to escape it.
didn't you go on a trip with your football team and you like brought a point and shoot camera?
Yeah. We traveled
really,
to
go ahead.
we traveled to Europe for like 9 days, and we were in Germany, Austria, Czech Republic. We played a couple of exhibition games. Yeah, and I had a camera, and I took, I don't know, probably over a dozen rolls of film. And some people questioned why I was, taking so many pictures, but it was sort of my way of seeing. And that was the first time I sort of had this apparatus. It was a way of seeing, and I think even in that moment, like that was the beginning of the escape.
Did you take pictures of the landscape, of like artifacts, or were you also taking pictures of people?
A lot of times there were different things. The landscape, I remember taking a photo of a street artist who was working in pastels, like just on the street, and they were like completely covered. Their skin was completely covered, and they were like using a source image from an art book. And I remember walking alongside one of the players, and I said, "Look at that! Isn't that cool?" And he kind of looked at me like I was crazy. And I photographed the person. And prior to taking that photography class, I didn't have, and so this was like right before, this was the summer before I took that photography class my last semester. And that was sort of the first time I was really exposing myself to art and to making.
Do you think that you will ever revert back, or not revert back to, but like return to your curiosity in photography?
I think I'll definitely revisit it. When I took that photography class, and I wasn't sure how I was going to pursue the medium or sort of making itself. Like, one of my options that I considered doing was I considered joining the military and trying to do like photojournalism. And I think that's something that I'm still a bit interested in. I'm interested in sort of like going to different places and capturing, what goes on in the world, and sort of, bringing things to light. And I think for me, even in the same way that I'm making right now and sort of the things that I address, it's about bringing things to light. At some point in time, it's highly possible. I'm not sure what it would fully look like, but always open to it.
I asked that in the context of my own deep skepticism around photography, and like Denny knows this, and to his chagrin, like I just I'm not necessarily invested in the photographic project, because I think my introduction to thinking about photography was thinking about how and Aria Dean says this, there's no image of blackness, or there's no image of the Black body that precedes photography. And photography was so instrumental in kind of contorting, criminalizing, pathologizing the ways that we imagine Blackness now. And it goes back to this question of like having a choice around the extent to which you're visible. And yeah, so first of all, like that. Second of all, what would it mean then, with all of that considered, to unmake or attempt to unmake the kind of origin of photography and unmake all of the ways that it has been used to illustrate the Black body as this thing that is like impervious to pain, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
It's hard to say, with you having said that, I remember, so when I was doing my undergraduate studies, I was working with a group, and I don't think I've shared this with you. I worked with a group of migrant workers who traveled between Indiana and Texas. And there was one time where I photographed a figure and I gave it as a gift, but I never photographed the figures and exhibited them like in an exhibition, if you will. Even at that point in time, like my early mid-20s, something. I was very concerned about objectification of the body.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So that was something that really stuck with that sort of that naturally instinctively was with me even at that point in time.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that answers your question.
No, absolutely. And I feel like, considering the slides already up here, I would love to talk about 48 Portraits Underexposed for a second, because when I asked you the question earlier, just very technically about how this was made, we thought about this instant where people approached the work and did not see the faces in it. And thinking about that as a moment of how could you not see the faces in this? But I've been thinking about it for the past couple of hours, and I think that there's also something really special about the way that the underexposure almost allows the figures to hide, and it almost kind of restricts or encrypts our access to their full likeness. And I'm not sure exactly what that does yet, but I think, there's something very profound about the fact that we can just about make out who these people are. I remember I had to ask for a high-res image to make this slideshow, and I was zooming in, and it took me a long time to just sit with it and try and identify the people who were there. So again, thinking about this question of how your work calls for curiosity and calls for questioning that then opens out onto this larger conversation, but then also thinking about what it means to restrict people's access to kind of quote knowing or quote understanding exactly what they're encountering. Because I think there's a lot to be said about hiding as a political strategy and not allowing yourself to be fully known by the powers that be as a political strategy that then allows you to evade being surveilled and to evade being captured. Again, not even really a question, just something that I noticed in the work, and I wonder if you have ever thought about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, shit, I think that, there's a concern for safety. When I lived in Chicago, there were a number of times there's extreme harassment from police officers, and even now, even though being here in Indiana, or just generally speaking, of not wanting to be out after dark. Definitely not be out on the weekends after dark, or my studio is about 25 minutes from home. There's a lot of times where I don't like to be at the studio or go to the studio, commute between the home and studio after dark on the weekends. Just out of avoiding being stopped and being bothered.
I wonder if there are also moments where our desire not to move, our desire to hide ourselves can be something that isn't necessarily always demanded by this desire to avoid the police, for instance, or a desire to avoid or move around, again, these structures that are predicated on our death. And I don't have an answer for what that looks like at all, but is also something I'm really invested in. What does refusal mean? What does opacity mean? And all of these other questions. More on that soon. I'm still gathering my thoughts on this one. I would also love to think about the reference of 48 Portraits Underexposed. So thinking about Gerhard Richter, who I don't know much about him, honestly, but I do know that he's lauded as someone who engaged very heavily in minimalism. And his 48 portraits were all of white people. I want to say all white men. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes.
So I'm curious if you think about, as we're unmaking white supremacy, as you're unmaking sort of normative forms of knowledge production, are you also thinking about unmaking something like the history of minimalism or the minimalist grid and the ways that art history has also been complicit in all of these questions?
My gosh. Something, this is something that I always have only spoken to individuals sort of one-on-one too, is this idea of minimalism. And I was in a conversation with a good friend of mine who was at some talk of some sort, where one of the people giving the talks, or was a part of the talk, was I think he formerly worked with the CIA.
Oh my God, great, great.
And had a conversation about the CIA's relationship with Jackson Pollock.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this theory that, you know, through that movement, that, you know, sort of minimalism, abstraction, you know, making art for the sake of making art was to rid, you know, the art of concept and ideas and thought-provoking ideas. And you know, what does that mean in terms of, you know, for me, when I approach my work, when I think about work, when I think about work in general, I'm only interested in sort of like, I don't know, there's a visual interest, but I'm interested in sort of how it engages me, how it engages the audience, how it makes the individual think about the way that we exist in the world. And if it doesn't do that, it's not doing anything. It's not enough. We have enough of that. We have enough things that sort of, that, you know, distract and abstract us from that, and that keep our heads in the sand.
Absolutely. I think this will probably be my final question, because we're going to open up for questions from other folks soon. But I'm interested in the question of noise as it relates to your practice. So, as you know, I have been reading the Undercommons, and there's another quote from the introduction that reads, "Our desire for harmony is arbitrary, and in another world, harmony would sound incomprehensible. Listening to cacophony and noise tells us that there is a wild beyond to the structures that we inhabit and that inhabit us." And as I'm imagining you in your studio, there are the sewing machines going, there may be like the apparatus that you use to pulp the books going. And so I feel like there is a sonic element to your practice. I also imagine that you might be listening to music while you're making your work. And I think that sonic quality, this idea of cacophony, emanates out from the work, and also is something that invites people to ask questions and be curious about things that they might have otherwise felt restricted from being curious about. And I wonder, again, if you think about this, I wonder if it is actually noisy, or maybe it's very quiet. Can you tell me more about that?
Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's noisy. I think the noise of the machine, the sewing machine, there's a rhythmic noise to it. And there's sort of like, you know, when I compose the works, I put them together, and there's a whole lot of attention that's given to that. But when I compose them and I pin them together, and I'm working with them or sewing them with the sewing machine, it creates this moment where I can just sort of, my mind can run free, and it's like, so it's not restricted. And there's a huge privilege to that. There's a huge privilege to being in a space where I'm by myself and I'm free to think and there's no one else around. I'm not on someone else's time schedule, or making or doing something that may feel mundane, useless for someone else or some other purpose. But it's also at the same time, even though it's a privilege, it's a burden too at the same time, in terms of like continuously being in a certain state of mind of dealing with, you know, so much like traumatic information, if you will. So it's difficult to have a balance with it as well.
Absolutely. Are there particular practices that you feel willing to share, or like habits or ways of inhabiting the world that kind of allow you not to feel always bogged down by the kind of material weight of the things that you are using?
You know, you and I were talking earlier about meditative music, healing frequencies, and we talked about a little bit about the different types of the different frequencies, and there are numbers. I think you mentioned what you mentioned 528. It's like 440. Sometimes I'll put music on in the studio to sort of like counter these things. But I'm been trying to meditate a whole lot more. Even when I go to sleep, you know, I put on meditative music to like bring myself down and to sleep. But you know, I have I don't think I really realize how much I isolate myself. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. I think you know, recently I had some time to isolate myself and be in some beautiful, vast open spaces where there were, you know, few people around, and sort of just able to take in nature. That's something that I really have come to appreciate, because I don't like, you just talked about the noise and the stimulation. It has to be very limited for me. I don't like a whole lot of noise and stimulation for long periods of time. And sometimes I get on my kids when they're having a good time and they're noisy, and I'm just like, it's like, but they, you know, I'm grateful that they respect that when I need some calm.
Absolutely. You just need good noise canceling headphones. That helps.
I should have some corded ones. These cordless ones are not the best for the body, but
apparently Bose makes really good ones.
It's about moderation.
There we go. Exactly. I get a notification on my phone all the time telling me that I've exposed myself to too much loud music for the week. So we're working on that. I love like blasting music in my ears. So we differ there, but I hear you. Okay, Denny, do you want to come back and help me moderate questions?
Yeah, for sure. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so we can take any questions that the audience has. So just lift or use the feature to raise your hand, and we'll get to you.
I also feel like I always get really scared in these settings when I want to ask a question. So if you would rather type it in the chat, or would rather kind of just like share a reflection on the conversation today or anything like that, it's so welcome. And while we wait for them to come in, I just want to say thank you, Sam, for talking with me. We've been chatting about this for a couple weeks now, so it feels good to do it. I appreciate
thank you. I'm really happy that sort of you touched on a lot of topics within the work that typically do not get talked about. So it's very refreshing.
It's always the goal, always the goal.
We'll take a question from Lexi. Go ahead.
Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Lexi, hi.
Perfect. Hello. I'm working with limited technology here, so hopefully I do not cut out. I have a question that is a question that I hate asking in art talks because it feels very basic, but I think here it's pertinent. I would love to hear more about the titles of the works because I think that they're very interesting. I wrote down one. My father said, "Don't be an asshole. Nobody likes an asshole." And they all just seem they seem like they reveal something about the work. And I think that when you're making abstract works, but based on objects that are very textual, the role of text seems very interesting to me. And I would love to hear more about the titles. Like, are they drawn from like personal life, or are they drawn from the textual sources, or both, or neither? I don't know. I would just love to hear more thoughts about the titles.
They come from, they can either be personal, they can be things that I've seen in the world. You know, that quote from my father, that was like, you know, a thing that he literally said to me on a number of occasions. But the reason I put that in there was because I used an element from a book that had the year 1947, which was the year that he was born, and it made me think of him. He passed away in 2009, which was strange because that was the same year. Actually, I finished that piece, maybe like that piece neck for neck was, I'm just now remembering this, completed about a month or two before he passed away. But yeah, you know, sometimes I would get in a funk about something, about some engagement that I had with someone, and just, you know, want to react in a certain way. And that was what he would say to me, you know? And it was more about, you know, just because someone else is an asshole doesn't mean you have to be, or that you should be. But yeah, he liked to use that with me a lot.
Thank you for that, Sam. And Lexi, for your question. Go ahead, Sam. What were you going to say?
But yeah, you know, the different titles, you know, in the works that I use, where I make works from law books, there are a number of times where I've used law books from a given state, and I'll title them after, you know, for example, there's this large piece that I have up in the space at the Contemporary Dayton in Ohio, titled Tamir, and they were made from Ohio law books and titled after Tamir because, you know, he lost his life in the state of Ohio. And there's a number of different works like that. But, you know, I think too, also in talking about just like kind of going off tangent a little bit, even in making the work, even though it's abstract, and we're talking about this idea of, you know, abstraction, minimalism, I call the works paintings, but I don't use paint. I use a very specific material. I don't just use any book. I use, you know, in particular encyclopedias, law books, medical books. I've even used art books as well. Here's a reference to issues of sort of like the canon, or the way in which medium exists or has a hierarchy, if you will, that determines value and importance. And that's the fun thing about using material that's not paint and calling it paint. It's a way of disrupting this idea of value system. When I think about that relationship to the value system that we give to the body, who's important, who's not important.
Did that answer your question, Lexi?
Yes, thank you.
So we have another one from Shanae. And Shanae says, each of you talked a little bit about the processes of working with the books, the water, the pulp. I'm wondering if you could talk about some of the haptic experiences you may or may not have with the materials. So like literally, what does it mean that you have to get so intimate, as in like with your hands, be manipulating these materials? Like is there some, like, how do they feel on your hands? Do you notice that? Do you not notice that?
Yeah, I do notice it's a lot of times the water is cold. When I pulp the material, it's mushy. When I strip the books from the cardboard, sometimes I can feel the adhesive from that material. Sometimes it dries. When it dries, it's sort of like a little bit sticky. But yeah, it's a very interesting process to strip the books. But most times, like I say, all the time when I'm stripping the books and when I put the water in, I use warm water. That softens the glue a bit quicker than using cold water, but over time, by the time I let it sit and I let it sit for hours or even overnight, the water becomes cold. So it just depends on how the books come apart. Sometimes the book cover material is paper. I don't work with that as much. Usually I just discard those because I like working with the cloth material. Yeah, it's really, I don't know, it's hard to describe the texture.
I wonder, because you apply the pulp particularly with your hands, right, onto the canvas.
Now I've been using, so I use an acrylic medium that I add to the pulp, and I use typically I'll wear gloves when I work with that material, but I use a putty knife. So it's a little bit messy, but before I was using that medium, I would apply it with my hands. But now just sort of in terms of, because it's pretty nasty when it dries. It's sticky and it's easier to use the putty knife to apply it.
I wonder also if the haptic dimension of making the work feels cathartic for you, like the fact that you with your own hands are the one unmaking these things.
Yeah, I mean, it does. There is a cathartic process, sort of therapeutic process of, destroying these books. And I remember, thinking back when I first started using encyclopedias, and I remember, a bit older and using, when the internet wasn't available, and using source material that was sort of very limited, and encyclopedias, if you want to do research or whatever, you just sort of, a lot of times you chose a topic based upon what was available within the library, because it wasn't as expansive, at least in the places that I had to go. And just sort of like thinking back on that, and like thinking about destroying these books, and thinking about, especially with the portraits. So the portraits, Richter's portraits, the source images were from the encyclopedia. And the strangest thing that happened is that when he first showed that work in 1972 in Venice. And when I acquired my first set of encyclopedia, they just so happened to be from 1972. Like, thumbing through the pages, and there's like predominantly white men who were being represented, and and then immediately thinking of all the histories and narratives that are intentionally left out of this material, and just like, there's not a true representation there. So there was definitely something there that was cathartic about just sort of like, taking out that aggression on that material. You're muted.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
There's something about the necessity of being able to come home to yourself, like, as cliche as that sounds, when you're out in the world being inundated by all of these images of you that are not really you, and like are so hell-bent on contorting your perception of yourself. And yeah, I wonder, something else for me to think more about is how the haptic dimension of your work and other work like it kind of allows for that process of being able to literally rest your head and go to sleep at night, or even just feel okay with yourself. Again, something for me to think more about. I have, wait a second, what did Allison say? 1 second. Okay, I'm gonna read the comments at the end. I have one more question for you, Sam, and it relates to something that an artist, Turquoise Dyson, has said. She similarly kind of is making these abstract compositions, and she's using paint, though, I will say. Of course, the practice is not comparable in that regard, but she said something that I have not stopped thinking about how she uses abstraction, as in like formal aesthetic abstraction, to combat and survive political abstraction. So again, thinking about all the ways that the language that has been used to describe our own trauma, to describe the ways that we've been harmed, is always abstract. So even like the example of the most recent, and I don't even want to bring this up, but I've started. So the most recent verdict with Kyle Rittenhouse, and all the ways that like the court was like, we can't call them victims, but we should call them victims. Like I try honestly not to indulge in reading about that very much, but that's something that was pause for concern for me. And this is all to ask you, I wonder if, again, this is something you think about, like using aesthetic abstraction as a way to combat political abstraction, as in the abstraction of the Black body, the abstraction of all of the ways that we've been harmed.
I might have to ask you to rephrase it somewhat.
Totally.
But
so Turquoise was saying that in the context of, again, like, what does it mean that if we take this example of the people that Kyle Rittenhouse killed, and thinking about how the court debated for a number of hours, if not days, about whether or not those people who were murdered should be called victims. That to me is a perfect example of this question of political abstraction, of not being able to use the language to clearly name what has happened. Then if we think about these medical, go ahead.
Yeah, I know Turquoise really well, and she also talks a whole lot about, sort of space and space in terms of architecture and the way that, it's utilized and abstracted to like position bodies in different ways. But the way in which you're talking about how, the system that's sort of, I don't know, maybe these rules or these like phrases are made up as you go along. So like the rules of the game are being made and changed to dictate the outcome. I don't know. It's like I don't even know that what went down there. That would even call abstraction. It's just it's very ludicrous in the sense that I don't know. It was I have no words for it. But to the way in which you sort of the attempt to create and define, someone and their body and how they exist in the world. To keep from, real justice from happening. It's, we also talked a little bit earlier about, we didn't really get into it, but we talked about, the issue of the female body, if you will. We were talking about abortion. And my comment was, you know, the valuelessness that's given to the female body, and talking about trauma and rape culture, and how that also, I'm sure it goes hugely hand in hand with the issue of, whether a woman can decide to have an abortion when her body was attacked outside of her own decision.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there's something really fucking problematic with, no accountability to a man's inability to control his dick.
Mm-hmm. 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 Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think my response was something along the lines of how the ways that someone's take on abortion is not something that my mother has ever had to worry or think about, because where she grew up, this is not something that is politicized. And I take that back halfway to say that, of course, no nation is immune to these things. But there is something that feels uniquely American about the ways that the question of someone's agency and autonomy around their own body can be used as a dividing line in a political charade. I don't know of any other nation that is as pernicious where that is concerned as America is. And this feels like a very heavy way to end the conversation, but maybe that is exactly where and how we need to end it. I wonder if you have anything else that you would like to share.
No.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Camille. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, everyone who attended today's program. Thank you to all our friends who also came as well too. Yeah, we had such a great conversation. I'm very proud of the outcome. And again, thank you all. Hope you enjoy your evening and your night. One